Hey guys, welcome to the Eastern Front, the second front of World War I. This front gets talked about a lot less in general, and is thankfully at least a little bit less depressing than the Western Front, because the battles here actually went somewhere. Generally not in Russia's favor, but they went somewhere. Generally not in Austria's favor. There were a lot more catastrophic defeats and glorious victories and dramatic results in the Eastern Front. When the West bogged into stalemate, the East a little bit, but there tended to be a lot of action. So let's dig into the Eastern Front first with an ominous warning from a famous Russian author. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said this. In 1914, he said, "Now that the lush and prosperous years had come to Russia, the last thing she needed was war. They should have just said a requiem mass for that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, after which the three emperors of Germany, Austria, and Russia should have drunk a glass of vodka at the wake and forgotten the whole affair." That's 1914. So we haven't even gotten to the disasters for Russia yet. But even from the get-go, Alexander Solzhenitsyn says, why are we going to war? We should have all just had a toast to Archduke Franz Ferdinand and then just moved on. The emperors should have just made an agreement. I want to remind you over and over and over and over again that really war was not inevitable. It seems like it in retrospect. We see all these systems in place, but the people in charge, because especially a lot of these are autocratic states with an absolute ruler, could have sat down and hammered out a peace. They could have just had a big funeral, drunk some vodka, and settled things. One reason that's especially true is this. They were cousins. 3 of them were cousins. Look at these pictures. Doing a great job here. This is the King of England, George V, and the Tsar of Russia on the left. And on the right, I see Wilhelm II, and I don't know which one the other one is. Actually, I think it's the same two. The King of England, George V, and the Tsar of Russia. I think they're just in German uniforms to confuse you. Look, they look the same. The English king, the Russian Tsar look exactly the same. They could have changed clothes and probably confused people. They were practically twins. They were cousins. And in fact, ironically, would often dress up in German military uniforms like their cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, just to confuse people. So again, you have George, who comes from a Germanic house. He changes the name of his house from the Saxe-Gothberg or something like that to the House of Windsor, which sounds much more British. You have Nicholas II of Russia, Nikolai, in the Russian version, but also Nicholas kind of sounds almost like a normal name you might see in England. George, Nicholas, and William. Wilhelm, Nikolai, and George. As they go. In fact, Kaiser Wilhelm II is reported to have said after the war that if my grandmother, Queen Victoria, had been alive, she would never have allowed it. Basically, she would never have allowed me and my cousins to get in a fight and go to war. She'd been like, smacking you around. Stop fighting, you kids. If you want to imagine it that way. Unfortunately, Queen Victoria was dead. By the way, I think the longest-lived monarch in all of history, Queen Victoria, and the real power player. And so I'm not going to go into all the details here. You can pause it and read through it. But basically, Queen Victoria was the direct grandmother of Kaiser Wilhelm II. She was also the direct grandmother of King George V of England. They were first cousins. And then Tsar Nicholas was related through the family. He's a third cousin of theirs. It gets complicated over there. But there you go. Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha. That was the royal family that King George V came from, that he changed his name to Windsor. Sounds a lot more British and a lot less German. And that's an important thing to remember here is at this time, European royal families were incredibly intermarried. It was very normal for that to happen. And they'd done this to prevent war. They all married each other to make peace, and so these rulers grew up together. in a lot of cases, they probably grew up attending major public events together and probably running around and playing in the back as kids. I believe Queen Victoria called Wilhelm and Nicholas Willie and Nicky. They sent letters to each other. They're cousins. They knew each other. And they really should have been able to resolve this. They really should have been able to restrain their people as some of these last autocratic rulers. But what you see is a last gasp of autocratic rulers because they fail to restrain their peoples and bring about many of their own destructions. The war begins with three cousins, two ganging up on one, George and Nicholas ganging up on Wilhelm, like always. They probably did when they were kids too. But only one of these three is going to survive the end of the war still as a ruler, and that's George V. Both Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm II will be out of power by the end of the war. So really, it would have been strong in their favor to just make peace, drink a toast to the Archduke, and avoid 8 million people dying. So let's go to Tannenberg. Let's get back to the Eastern Front. At Tannenberg, you had the first great German victory of the war outside the Western Front. So remember in the Schlieffen Plan, the plan was to send 7/8 of the army to the Western Front and crush France in 40 days and only leave a tiny fraction, 1/8 of the army, in East Prussia to defend against the Russians. Well, the Russians mobilized faster than the Germans anticipated. The German line gets bogged down in France. That fails. They don't get the chance to swing the army back. And so Ludendorff, the commander of the German army in the east, finds himself with a very small army facing a very large Russian army extremely quickly and in trouble. So what he manages to do, though, is the Russian army is split into two pieces, and those two pieces get separated by time and distance and travel, by the logistics, the same stuff that messed up the Schlieffen Plan. So you have Ludendorff with 150,000 troops facing off against a Russian army with 200,000 troops at Gambingen, the Russian First Army, and meanwhile the Russian Second Army has 150,000 troops, so he's outnumbered more than 2-1. So first he fights a defensive position against the slower Russian army, while he lets the faster one get deeper in towards Germany. Then he retreats, but the Russian army doesn't realize he's retreated. He jumps on the railway, he zips down, and he manages to surround the Second Russian Army at Tannenberg and crushes them. Meanwhile, the First Russian Army is unable to follow. The Germans probably destroyed the railroad on their retreat and can't get there to save them. Ludendorff surrounds and destroys the 150,000 troops. He captures, I think, about 90,000 to 100,000 of them at Tannenberg and completely collapses half of the Russian army. The second half, reeling from that defeat, is largely immobilized. They attack some defensive forces, and this victory saves East Prussia and in large part saves the German war effort. If Ludendorff had failed and the Russians had crushed him, they would have had to commit massive amounts of troops to their defense, which would have weakened the Western Front and possibly allowed the Allies to make a breakthrough there, or the Russians might have just swept into Germany and taken out Berlin and other things. Instead, we have images of Russians dropping their weapons and surrendering here on the Eastern Front at Tannenberg, one of the greatest victories of the war, which is really going to make Ludendorff and his co-commander Hindenburg immensely popular in Germany. By the end of the war, they are going to be in charge of the German war effort because they're the guys who bring success and results. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, Falkenhayn and Moltke are just leading to stalemates and failures. So, Ludendorff makes his name at Tannenberg. Let's go one more. So, another major offensive here that's going to happen in 1915, I believe, a year later, is the Germans are going to have a major breakthrough. So meanwhile, the Austrians and the Russians have been fighting, and the Austrians have mostly been getting the negative side of it. Russia has been beating Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary's armies are incredibly diverse, and they're discoordinated, and they just can't handle the Russians. So the Russians are making breakthroughs there, and Germany realizes that in order to save the Eastern Front, the Austrians from collapse, and even though they've protected Germany, they need to reinforce Austria and send reinforcements. So as the war goes on, more and more German troops are going to be devoted to the Eastern Front to rescuing Austria. And one of the major breakthroughs there is a combined German-Austrian offensive is going to save Austria-Hungary from collapse in 1915. And that's called the Gorlice Tarr Offensive. That's because it happened between the towns of Gorlice and Tarnow. You don't need to memorize that. Anyway, in the area between Gorlice and Tarnow, the Russians had not entrenched. Unlike the Western Front, where At the end of 1914, the trenches are there, and they basically stay there and move a tiny little bit. In the Eastern Front, there's a lot more movement. There's a lot more maneuvering. There's huge amounts of space and troops along it. And so in this area, the Germans and the Austrians noticed the Russians haven't dug in. They haven't built any real trenches. There's no sophisticated defenses. We can break through there. And so they amass a force. They blast through with their artillery, obliterating the Russian defenses, and they just pour through the gap that gets open in the Russian army and send the Russian army into complete headlong retreat because a huge hole is opened up in their lines. They're afraid of getting flanked. There are 2 million Russian casualties in this offensive, 1 million that die or are wounded and 1 million that are captured as the Germans just pour in. They take all of Poland from Russia, a huge area. I can zoom in on the map here. And you can see again a bunch of armies and things. The Carpathian Mountains, Austria-Hungary is here, and up here is Poland. And all these red lines are these German advances, whereas the blue line is the initial front, and the red line on the right is the front later. It is a massive, massive breakthrough with some huge victories largely brought about by a major German intervention to save Austria. So the upside is they save Austria, major victory. The downside is for the rest of the war, Germany is going to be saving Austria. Austria is under this sort of constant threat of collapse. It will by the end. Again, we'll get there later. But actually, all three of the countries fighting over here will all collapse by the end of the war. But they save them, and they're going to have to keep committing forces to save them. And Hindenburg and Ludendorff and their sub-commanders are going to become very famous from these victories, but they cost hundreds of thousands of men for the Germans too. They require the commitment of thousands of men, they require the commitment of material, and in distracting them, it makes them unable to really do much on the Western Front. So in 1915, the Germans are really just going to defend, because they're focusing all their troops on the Eastern Front, and in 1916, outside of Verdun, they're still going to mostly defend. Really, until after 1914, until 1918, the Germans are mostly on defense in the Western Front and on the offense in the Eastern Front, or defending both because of limited troop forces. So one more, and then we'll cut videos so I don't go too long for you guys. And that is the last major offensive we're going to look at here is the Brusilov Offensive, because in 1916, the Germans think the Austrians are beaten. They hope so. Again, they don't want to, sorry, the Austrians, the Russians. The Germans think the Russians are beaten. They hope so. They keep trying to drive them back. The Gorlice Tarr Offensive and Tannenberg, these huge Russian losses. The Russian army had retreated massively there to a new defensive line, and they thought, good, maybe they'll just back out. And they're constantly saying, hey, Russia, if you just sign a treaty, we don't have to kill any more of your people. But the Russians are not backing down. They have agreements with the Allies. Now they've lost Poland, and that's a major offense to Nicholas, that huge portion of land that was Russian, and the Germans are in Russian land. So in 1916, they surprised the Germans. The Germans don't realize that the Russian army has continued to mobilize men. They've killed so many Russians, they're like, surely Russia can't handle this. They can't handle the bleeding. We chopped off their arm. And Russia's like, we put on prosthetic arm and keep fighting. Russia. So in 1916, a Russian general named Brusilov, good name, Brusilov, launches the Brusilov Offensive. It's a major Russian offensive. It's a total surprise attack. The Germans do not see it coming, the Austrians. The Austrian army collapses under this massive Russian offensive. There are 1 million casualties on each side, and Brusilov takes back most of the territory that was lost in Gorlice Tarr. He takes huge amounts of things. He drives the Austrians back into Austria. The Austrians are in full retreat towards their capitals, in large part because the Austrians are worn down. They were never a strong army to begin with. They were never a united army to begin with. And in the first 2 years of the war, most of the troops that are really loyal to the Austrian emperor, most of the troops that were good fighters, are dead. Remember, this war was all about terrible tactics that got people died. Well, the Austrians' best troops and their most loyal troops were all the ones who won and fought those hard-won victories in the beginning, and they died. And they got replaced with untrained conscripts and less loyal troops and people from other parts of the empire. So when this happens, the Slavs, a major part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, which is like 8 countries, I'll get to that in a later video, they desert. a bunch of the Austrian troops now are from these people groups in the Austrian Empire that don't want to be part of Austria-Hungary. They want to be independent. So when the Russians are coming and the Austrian army is collapsing, they're like, I'm going to help the Russians, or peace out, I surrender. I don't want to die for an empire I don't believe in. I don't want to die for what I see as an oppressive regime. And so huge numbers of Austrian troops will just surrender and desert during this offensive. It's remarked that the Austrian army collapses. Their morale is gone. There's no cohesion. Their leaders can't organize them. And they are just in total disarray. Again, Germany is going to send troops. They're going to shore it up. They're going to save Austria-Hungary and stop the Russian advance. But also the Russians lose 1 million men in the process, and that is massive. The thing about this war is that Russia has more men to lose than anybody else, and that's important because they're going to lose a ton of men and keep fighting losses that in any other country probably would have knocked them out of the war, but Russia just has millions more men to call upon, and so it takes them a while. In the early days, they don't have enough guns for all of them, and so again, it's like wait for your friend to die and then pick up his gun. But over time, they will catch up those arms, and they will just keep throwing hundreds of thousands and millions of men into battle. And in 1916, the Germans don't think they can do it, but they do. And because of that, the Germans are busy at Verdun, trying to kill the French army, and then defending the Somme, and then they wind up needing to send troops to protect Austria-Hungary because of the Brusilov Offensive. And that's largely why Verdun fails. The Germans can't keep enough troops there because of it. So the Russians really, in many ways, perhaps save the Western Front with this offensive. This major offensive really throws Germany off in 1916 and prevents Falkenhayn and some of the other plans from having really any chance of success because men and guns and artillery all needs to be shipped over to the east to stop Brusilov. So, there he is, Brusilov, perhaps the most effective of Russian generals. Look into his eyes. He looks very stern and strong. This was largely done through valiant infantry charges after heavy artillery barrage, massive use of cavalry, as you can see Russian cavalry here charging during this offensive. The Russians amassed their forces. They did it old-fashioned, but again, it's a surprise. They use a massive amount of firepower to overwhelm the German and Austrian lines and destroy their trenches and their defenses, which aren't that sophisticated, and they don't expect the Russians to be capable of it. And then they just pour through with men. So really, this is what all the generals have wanted to do. Gorlice Tarr was the same way: bombard the enemy, pour through with massed infantry, ride through with cavalry. It works. It almost never works in the Western Front. It works a couple of times in the Eastern Front. Gorlice Tarr now, and Brusilov especially. Now they're also getting better at knowing when to stop, at knowing when to bring their artillery up, at using surprise and shock. They're refining the arts of it, but there's nothing that fancy about the Brusilov offensive. Millions of men, or hundreds of thousands of men, tons of cannons and artillery, surprise attack, and a victory. So we will continue in a later video. If you have any questions, again, bring them to the Zoom.